Boa tarde, pessoal. Todos bem? Novamente aqui, mais um Tiaços, que hoje vai ter a grande honra de receber Mark Saban. Como vai, Mark? Tudo bem? Isa, você está ouvindo ele, Isa? Isa?
Ele precisa desativar o microfone, ativar o microfone, está desativado.
Ok, tem que escrever. Mike, your mic. Deixa eu, peraí. Vamos ver se ele consegue agora. Your mic is closed, Mark.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, we got there. Yeah. So, Marcus, am I supposed to be able to hear Issa translating now as well?
Ok. Bom, seja bem-vindo, Mark. É um prazer ter você aqui. Há muito tempo que eu queria convidá-lo para você falar no nosso público brasileiro. Eu acho que a gente vai ter uma bela...
I can hear you, Issa. Yeah, good.
Há muito tempo eu queria chamá-lo para você participar do nosso grupo Tiaços. Você tem se tornado uma referência muito forte entre vários grupos junguianos brasileiros e acho que nós vamos ter uma bela tarde de trabalho, Mark. Eu queria só fazer a tua apresentação formal. Deixa eu só ler aqui, por favor. Só um minuto. O Mark fez a sua formação com um grupo independente de psicólogos analíticos, através do qual se tornou analista sênior. Ele, nos últimos 2 anos, tem trabalhado como professor do Departamento de Estudos Psicossociais e Psicanalíticos da Universidade de Essex. Mark estudou estudos clássicos em Oxford e depois ele trabalhou por 20 anos como ator. Ele publicou inúmeros artigos e capítulos de livros. Mark é co-editor desse livro, Análise e Ativismo, junto com Samuels, Emily Kill, um livro bastante interessante. E o Mark publicou esse livro, Two Souls Alas, As Duas Personalidades de Jung e o Fazer da Psicologia Analítica, né? É um livro excepcional que vale a pena a gente poder trabalhar sobre ele. Mark, seja muito bem-vindo. É um grande prazer te receber. Espero que você goste da nossa presença. A palavra é toda tua.
Thank you very much, Marcus. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be here talking to you. And I can't quite believe I am really sitting in Oxford, England, talking to how many 99 interested parties in Brazil, but here I am. It's the miracle, the modern miracle. So it's really lovely to be here this evening. It's evening here. I know it's afternoon where you are. So what I want to talk about today, really this talk is a kind of self-contained talk, which is about the notion, Jung's notion of the secret, and how that played out in his early years, and then looking at the way in which Jung's notion of the secret started to play a part in terms of the breakup with Freud. And this is, as I say, a self-contained talk, but it is also part of a chapter in the book that Marcus kindly showed to you just now. And it has a place in my overall argument about Jung's two personalities and the way in which Jung developed his mature psychology, at least partly out of his experiences having to deal with these two personalities as he describes them in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. So I'm going to read the talk, if I may. I'll try and make it as animated as I can. If there's any problem at any point with the internet connection, so if I freeze or anything like that, I hope that when I come back, please tell me that this has happened, and at that point I will stop and go back and start again where it went wrong. Hopefully that won't be necessary. Hopefully it will all run smoothly. I've got quite a good internet connection, so I hope that it'll work. Okay, so let me just find my talk and I'll start. So the talk is entitled Secrets and Lies. And there's a quotation which begins this talk. It's a quotation from the English psychoanalyst Winnicott. And the quotation goes like this: "It is a joy to be hidden, but a disaster to be found." So I want to look now first at the personal dimension of the Freud-Jung relationship. And what I want to argue today is that in order to fully grasp the significance of this crucial friendship to Jung, we need to take into account Jung's early experiences as recounted in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. By the way, I should have said, this talk should take, I think, probably less than an hour, but I'm trying to speak clearly and slowly so that Isa can keep up in terms of the translation, so it may take a bit longer, but I'm hoping it will come out about that length. Now, the word secret, or in German, Geheimnis, peppers the initial sections of Memories, Dreams, Reflections. In the first chapter, the word appears in the specific context of certain highly significant dreams, games, activities, and experiences. These include Jung's underground phallus dream, quotation, through this childhood dream, I was initiated into the secrets of the earth. They include the affinity of that dream to Oriental God images, quote, it was a secret I must never betray. It includes the stone on which Jung sat, wondering if he was the stone or the sitter. There was no doubt whatsoever, Jung says, that this stone stood in some secret relationship to me. About the carved mannequin Jung hid in the attic, he says, all this was a great secret. No one could discover my secret and destroy it. And the scrolls Jung hid in the mannequin's box, he says, these were written in a secret language of my own invention. These are all quotations from Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. Now, in the same chapter, Jung devotes an extended passage to the significance of the secret. I'll quote it. This possession of the secret, Jung says, had a very powerful formative influence on my character. I consider it the essential factor of my boyhood. I was always absorbed by it and had the feeling I ought to fathom it, and yet I did not know what it was I was trying to express. I always hoped I might be able to find something, perhaps in nature, that would give me the clue and show me where or what the secret was. And when religious teachings were pumped into me and I was told this is beautiful and this is good, I would think to myself, yes, but there is something else, something very secret that people don't know about. So what we can see here is that for Jung, the secret had a kind of ineffable quality, an inexpressible quality. Of course, Jung's experiences could have been put into words, and yet the particular quality that the secret possessed for Jung seems to have remained somehow inaccessible and mysterious. As he puts it, the secret evoked, quote, a feeling of curious and fascinating darkness. The carved mannequin, and by implication all the other numinous experiences from this time that I just mentioned, were, he says, merely attempts, still unconscious and childish, to give shape to the secret. And later he says he hoped in vain that nature would, quote, give him the clue and show him where or what the secret was. So the essence of the secret, he's implying, always somehow transcended these actual objects and events and remained ultimately unknowable. Now, this quality contributed, of course, to Jung's enormous difficulty in conveying the secret to others. But the problem went much further than this. For Jung, even the thought of attempting to communicate the secret felt like a dreadful betrayal, and he was haunted by the fear that such a betrayal could be literally fatal. He remembers thinking that these secrets, he says, must never be betrayed, for the safety of my life depended on it. Now, strictly speaking, of course, it was impossible for Jung to betray a secret that was, as we have seen, inaccessible to himself. But for Jung, it would seem that the very attempt to translate the secret into superficial or clumsy everyday language held the capacity to undo the cohesion of his own inner identity, an identity that increasingly seemed to depend upon the possession of the secret. Now, as a result of all this, Jung's secret left him feeling intensely isolated. He tells us, it induced in me an almost unendurable loneliness. And this in turn brought up a compensatory need to communicate the secret. More than ever, he says, I wanted someone to talk with. However, this need to communicate was tempered by another need to ensure his safety. Before feeling able to speak, Jung needed to first, he says, find out whether other people had undergone similar experiences. And this all left him in a state of acute inner conflict. He had to speak, but he couldn't speak. So what Jung dreaded here was the destructive incomprehension of others. He tells us, for example, that he didn't speak to his mother about his book of Oriental gods because, he says, he, quotes, knew that she would reject my revelation with horror, and I did not want to expose myself to any such injury, a strong word. Later, Jung describes himself sensing, quotes, in others an estrangement, a distrust, an apprehension which robbed me of speech. And later still, he identifies the world of the secret with his number 2 personality, which, quote, felt that any conceivable expression of himself would be like a stone thrown over the edge of the world, dropping soundlessly into infinite night. Now, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung tells us that when he first encountered Nietzsche, the German philosopher, he recognized the philosopher's story as terrifyingly familiar, at least, he says, in regard to the secret, which had isolated him from his environment. Perhaps, Jung says, who knows? He had inner experiences, insights, which he had unfortunately attempted to talk about and had found that no one understood him. Now, Jung's own attempts to speak about these matters with his father were fruitless. He tells us he, quote, dared not and could not reveal his great secret to his father, who he knew was incapable of understanding the direct experience of God, Jung tells us. Feeling increasingly isolated, Jung wanted to share who he really was, his innermost private identity, with others. But he didn't know how to do it. Crippled by dread, he was unable to trust the world as a safe place to receive his attempts to communicate this crucial inner sense of secret. In effect, for Jung, to live isolated with the secret meant living solely as the inner-facing, unrelational personality number two. At times, Jung seems to have been aware that the one-sidedness of a life like this would make it cripplingly neurotic. For example, although in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung tells us that the fainting fits he suffered as a child did indeed enable him to avoid school and to, quote, plunge into the world of the mysterious, he did eventually realize that this one-sided arrangement, one-sidedly personality number two arrangement, was in fact psychologically unhealthy. Jung says, that was when I learned what a neurosis is. Jung knew on some level that he needed a life that made space for both the inner-facing personality number two and the outward-looking personality number one. And in this context, what that meant was finding a way to communicate his secret to another person. However, at other times, the dread that had accompanied Jung's experience of the secret seems to have overridden this awareness. And in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, we find Jung boasting about his ability to remain silent about the secret. And he provides a rationalization of this tendency towards one-sided isolation. He says, my one great achievement during those years was that I resisted the temptation to talk about the secret with anyone. He goes on, thus the pattern of my relationship to the world was already prefigured. Today, as then, I am a solitary, because I know things and must hint at things which other people do not know, and usually do not even want to know. But it seems to me that there's a problematic contradiction here. Because on the one hand, Jung wants to convince us that his own individuation process required an experience of creative connection between outward-looking personality number one and inward-looking personality number two, and that this process holds inner and outer engagement as equally valuable. But on the other hand, he also seems to want to argue that if we maintain a hermetically sealed inner life, this is more important than the outer life of relationship. And in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Late Thoughts, he amplifies this idea. He says there is no better means of intensifying the treasured feeling of individuality than the possession of a secret which the individual is pledged to guard. The individual on his lonely path needs a secret which, for various reasons he may not or cannot reveal, only a secret which the individual cannot betray, one which he fears to give away, or which he cannot formulate in words, and which therefore seems to belong to the category of crazy ideas, can prevent the otherwise inevitable retrogression, and he means into neurosis. So this feels like quite a problematic passage to me, because what Jung is doing here is developing a sort of quasi-heroic justification for his own decision to follow what he represents as an isolated path. But when we look more closely at it, this passage seems increasingly confused, because first of all, Jung identifies this idea of the treasured feeling of individuality, as he puts it, with a state of lonely isolation, and implicitly identifies it with a state of separation from society and one's fellow man. But this idea itself seems to conflict with Jung's claims elsewhere, lots of claims elsewhere, that individuation brings us into closer relation to others. Second, Jung puts forward two related reasons why this individuated person should not communicate the secret. A, fear, and B, inarticulacy. An inarticulacy stemming from the assumption that anyone hearing the secret would dismiss it as a, quote, crazy idea. But since, as we know, Jung, aware of Nietzsche's example, is terrified of his ideas as being seen as crazy, in effect, this reduces the second category to the first. So it's all about fear. So Jung seems to be telling us that the one way to avoid neurosis is to have a secret that one is frightened of expressing. This bizarre idea only really makes any psychological sense if we understand it in the light of those early chapters of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where it was precisely Jung's own secret that he could not betray and that he feared to give away, and that he could not formulate in words, and which therefore seemed to belong to the category of crazy ideas. So in effect, what Jung is doing is retrospectively justifying the defensive fearfulness he felt in childhood by transforming it into a universal prophylactic against neurosis. I think it's crucial to remind ourselves at this point that Jung's emphatic embrace of secret keeping as a recipe for psychic health is not necessarily his last word on the topic. As is often the case, as I'm sure you know, everywhere in Jung's writings we find contradictions, contrasting passages which imply at the very least some kind of ambivalence with regard to this whole question. For example, elsewhere in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung tells us this. He says, in many cases in psychiatry, the patient who comes to us has a story that is not told and which, as a rule, no one knows of. To my mind, Jung says, therapy only really begins after the investigation of that wholly personal story. It is the patient's secret, the rock against which he is shattered. If I know his secret story, I have a key to the treatment. The doctor's task is to find out how to gain that knowledge. In therapy, the problem is always the whole person, never the symptom alone. We must ask questions which challenge the whole personality. So Jung is suggesting here that the therapeutic process enacts a meeting between therapist and patient within this dimension of the secret. And it's only the speaking and the hearing of that secret that releases the patient from the neurosis. A release that Jung evocatively equates to a shattering against the rock of the secret. And this idea, and lots of similar ideas that we find throughout Jung's works on psychotherapy, in Collected Works, Volume 16, emphasize the importance of mutuality in the therapeutic relationship, of course. And elsewhere, Jung makes it perfectly clear that there is actually no real contradiction between accepting that the secret is an unknowable and inexpressible dimension of the psyche, but at the same time wishing to shape and communicate such an experience with others. Even in the places such as Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where Jung insists upon the importance of the secret, of course, his words represent a simultaneous attempt to communicate the secret. That's what he's doing when he wrote the book. That's what he's doing by publishing the book. So this is a case not only where he divulges childhood experiences he'd hitherto never mentioned, but more importantly, in the eloquent and lengthy description of the highly personal and intimate feelings and ideas that made up his number 2 personality. And in fact, one could argue that every word of Jung's mature psychology is, in fact, a more or less successful attempt to convey the secret to the outer world. What Memories, Dreams, Reflections does emphasize is the highly personal significance of the secret for Jung. Given the close relationship between Jung's number 2 personality and the realm of the secret, and the energy and the numinosity and the autonomy that both seem to share, Jung's complexed and perhaps neurotic attitude towards the secret seems to point to a similarly unbalanced approach with regard to personality number 2. Now, in the case of the secret, I think we can identify 3 quite different notions, which at times seems to, these 3 ideas seem to be confused together in Jung's writings. The first is this: the notion that psychology necessarily confronts a reality which is ultimately conceptually ungraspable, and thereby deals with an unknowable mystery that cannot be fully conceptualized, the unconscious. The second notion is the notion that there is an aspect of the human personality that must and will always remain ultimately hidden and is therefore ultimately unreachable, even through psychoanalytic means. But thirdly, there's another notion which is sometimes mixed up, I think, in the way that Jung writes about the secret. And this is the notion that there exists a given set of facts and ideas and understandings that can be known, but must or should not be openly spoken about. And it's this third notion, I think, which is highly problematic, not least because it leads us in the direction of psychology as a kind of esoteric, even cult-like discipline. Okay, I'm going to move on now to talking about what all this has to do with Jung's relationship with Freud, and specifically the breakup with Freud. So one way to approach the crisis that brought about Jung's confrontation with the unconscious, the writing of the Red Book, and the creation of analytical psychology as we know it, is to see it as a kind of enantiodromic shift within Jung, whereby a period of relative emptiness and barrenness, permeated by superficial outer encounters, was superseded by a rich and soulful period characterized by solitude and inner work. And if you follow this argument, what comes out of it is that the period of collaboration with Freud was, by definition, therefore, sterile and shallow in comparison with what came afterwards. And this rendering of events is given some rhetorical force within the early sections of the Red Book. And in fact, scholar Sonu Shamdasani has subsequently given it added emphasis. So if we translate this narrative that I'm talking about here into the language of the two personalities, the argument would be that in order for Jung to give birth to analytical psychology as we know it, an enantiodromic swing across from personality number 1 to personality number 2 was required. And Shamdasani indeed suggests that Jung ended a period of reflective self-analysis when he married Emma Jung in 1902, on the grounds that at this point he ceased writing in the private diary or notebook in which he'd been jotting down private thoughts since adolescence. So Shamdasani sees enormous significance in the fact that he restarts this practice again in 1913 after an 11-year break with the first entries in the Black Books, which have just been published, of course. However, although this does indicate clearly a shift in the direction of increased introspection, it seems to me we should be wary of attaching too much importance to it. According to Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung's psychiatric work at the Burgholzli provided him with a vessel within which he could pursue both inner, number 2, and outer, number 1, interests, thus constellating what he calls the confident feeling that he was a united double nature, which I read as saying that personality number 2 and personality number 1 were both somehow present. I would also argue that it was precisely because both personalities seemed to be working here in tandem that Jung was able, during his Burgholzli years, to concentrate his energies upon clinical and experimental work which expressed both sides of his personality. However, during the same period, Jung, who had experienced a lonely and isolated childhood, as we have seen, also found himself entering into relationships with both men and women that hinted at, for the first time, the possibility of cooperation, mutuality, love, friendship, and most importantly, perhaps, seemed to offer Jung an opportunity to experience in the outside world, as it were, a meeting between personalities number 1 and personalities number 2. So the question that needs asking is whether Jung was proactively engaging with the interests and concerns associated with personality number 2 during the 11 years between 1902 and 1913, or whether, as Shamdasani suggests, they remained mostly unexplored and unexpressed in this period. So what I want to argue here is that in this period, in the period, especially the period 1906 to 1912, the period which Shamdasani insists was relatively sterile and soulless, in fact, during that period, Jung was making several serious attempts in the arena of his outer relationships to communicate those ideas and feelings and motifs that he had placed in the category of the secret, and which, as we have seen, constitute aspects of his number 2 personality. And of these attempts, the most important occurred inside the context of his relationship with Freud. Before I move on, I mean, another example of that would be if we looked at his relationship with Sabine Spielrein. I think that's another kind of vessel in which Jung attempts something of the same sort in a very different way and a different context. However, to come back to the relationship with Freud, if we pay close attention to the secret in the context of that relationship, and especially in its catastrophic ending, we can see the plausibility of this alternative narrative. So, according to this version of events, it was the traumatic failure of Jung's sincere attempts to establish dialogue in the outer world through his relationship with Freud, through his relationship with Spielrein, that constellated such a shift in the direction of intrapsychic dialogue. So looked at from this perspective, Jung's encounter with Freud represents actually a genuine attempt via the medium of outer relationship to bring personality number one together with personality number two. And it was the failure of this attempt which pushed Jung to retreat into an inner world within which the crucial dialogue between number one and number two could take place. But of course, now on a purely intrapsychic level, i.e. between ego and unconscious. Now, despite the fact that I and others have argued elsewhere, Jung's approach to the psyche was in many ways closer to the model of, for example, Frederick Myers or Theodore Flournoy or William James than it ever was with the psychoanalytic model. And that's something I argue in a different chapter of the book. It's important also to acknowledge that Jung's most important personal and professional relationship during these years was, of course, his relationship with Sigmund Freud. And as late as 1953, the sheer numinosity of this relationship with Freud clearly remained utterly undiminished for Jung. In a conversation with psychoanalyst Kurt Eisler, Jung, aged 78, gushes, "I loved Freud a great deal, admired and loved him so much. He could grasp all emotional states in others wonderfully, so in that he was admirable. It goes to show, doesn't it, what bigness, what depth he had, you know. It was a terrible disappointment to him that I turned away from him. And for me, it was the same. So for me, the break with Freud was a terrible loss. It would have been crazy, you know, to have ever wanted anything other than to work together with him." Now, Renos Papadopoulos has in several works explored the theme of Jung and the other. And Papadopoulos has made the interesting suggestion that Jung's sense of connection with Freud relied partly upon the assumption that the theme of the other, as Papadopoulos puts it, had the same inner meaning for Freud as it had for himself. And this assumption, Papadopoulos suggests, engendered in Jung a, quote, special shiver of hope which must have activated hordes of expectations in Jung that Freud would assist him in solving their common problematic. And of course, the problematic that Papadopoulos is pointing to, and I would say, is the problematic of the two personalities. And certainly, despite all the considerable professional and personal achievements of Jung in the period 1902 to 1906, Jung seems to have remained disturbingly prone to the magnetic influence of his number two personality. There's a passage in Memories, Dreams, Reflections where he describes how even in his mid-30s, the world of the secret continued to exercise a powerful allure. He revisits the stone on which as a child he had sat wondering if he was the stone or the sitter, and he reflects I thought suddenly of my life in Zurich, and it seemed alien to me, like news from some remote world and time. This was frightening, for the world of my childhood, in which I had just become absorbed, was eternal, and I had been wrenched away from it and had fallen into a time that continued to roll onward, moving farther and farther away. The pull of that other world was so strong, I had to tear myself violently from the spot in order not to lose hold of my future. So here again, we see this secret dimension that had seemed so impossible to speak about in his childhood and youth, but which, as we have seen, he privately yearned to convey to someone who might understand. And I would argue that it was precisely this dimension that Jung began tentatively to shape and communicate at the start of his relationship with Freud. Freud's insistence upon the importance of a scientific attitude in dealing with the depths of the psyche not only offered a plausibly respectable screen for Jung's hitherto unacceptable interests, but it also offered Jung a way to sustain and develop an approach whereby his number one personality could be brought into play with his number two, an approach which I would describe as a binocular approach, because it achieves a sort of double vision that gains a kind of three-dimensionality. Now, Renos Papadopoulos suggests that within this relationship, Freud's own unconscious needs did in fact parallel those of Jung, so that Jung also became, for Freud, a kind of inner other. And indeed, this idea is supported by Freud's biographer, Elizabeth Roudinesco's observation that, quote, the irrational part of Freud would always lead him to defy the order of reason, whether through his interest in occult phenomena and telepathy, or through his attraction to the most extravagant speculations. So we might even go so far as to describe this irrational part of Freud as a number two personality, perhaps. And so, like Jung's number two personality, this facet of Freud's personality was generally secreted from public view. When it comes to Freud's interest in telepathy, for example, and thought transference, he orders Ferenczi, he says to him, let us keep absolute silence about it. So it's possible that this subterranean communication of Jung's secret was met, as it were, by a parallel secret within Freud. And perhaps this was one of the factors that really drew the two men together. Leonard Schengold suggests Freud found in Jung, as he had in Wilhelm Fliess, something he longed for, the promise of magic, which corresponded to something Freud mistrusted in his own personality and felt as a deficiency that would be supplied by another man. So what develops is a novel, tentative attempt by Jung to engage with his own personality number two through the means of an outer relationship with an actual person, Freud. And we can see an example of this when we look at the intimate nature of what Jung was communicating to Freud from early in their correspondence. In a 1986 paper, Herbert Lehmann draws attention to the particular significance of an admission Jung made to Freud in 1906. He confessed to Freud that in his book on dementia praecox, a dream he had represented as that of a patient was in fact his own dream. And the dream in question, as Lehmann convincingly shows, speaks in symbolic terms about the tension and conflict between two aspects of Jung's life. That aspect represented by wife and family, which, as we will see, Jung tended to associate with personality number 1, and a problematically different aspect, which Lehmann persuasively argues was related to Jung's affair with Sabine Spielrein. And as I say, in a different chapter of the book, I explore the ways in which the relationship with Spielrein, like that of Freud, offered Jung the opportunity to engage with qualities and ideas associated with personality number 2. But the point is that Jung was willing to share the dream with Freud and to request from him an interpretation. And this clearly implies that even at this very early stage of the friendship, Jung, as Lehmann says, felt that he could let his number 2 loose upon Freud because Freud knew and understood about such things. So the striking openness, vulnerability that characterize Jung's earliest letters to Freud demonstrate, as Lehmann puts it, an extraordinary demonstration of trust on Jung's part. And we can also see that Jung's openness evoked parallel feelings in Freud. And it was surely this potential, at least, for mutual frankness and intimacy which underpinned the significance of the relationship on both sides and made it so important to both men. Jung was being given the confidence to reveal highly personal and delicate areas of his life. However, Jung's attempt to utilize Freud as a combination of friend, colleague, supervisor, and analyst inevitably led him into problems. For example, in his letter of the 10th of October 1907, Jung courageously reveals to Freud an incident of sexual abuse that seems to have occurred when Jung was 17 years old. And unfortunately, we don't have Freud's letter in reply, but it's clear from the subsequent correspondence that Freud failed to respond in a way that might have allowed Jung to experience the relationship as a safe place in which he could further explore feelings, and especially how they might be influencing the very relationship between the two men. In effect, Freud seems to have sought to prioritize the collegial nature of the relationship over the analytic aspects of the relationship. And as a result, the subject was dropped, never mentioned again. And I think that this event must have, on some level, dented Jung's hope that he might have found a safe place in which he could divulge his most closely held secrets. Nonetheless, for the moment, however, the promise that Freud's friendship held clearly outweighed its dangers. Let me just have a glass of wine. Nevertheless, it was inevitable, I think, that Jung's intimacy with Freud would start bringing the older man into increasing proximity to those dimensions of Jung's life which, as we have seen, he had spent many years secreting from the outer world. And not surprisingly, Jung's critical ambivalence towards Freud, which actually was the subject he was trying to open up in the very letter where he divulged the sexual abuse, intensified accordingly. And eventually it hardened into something, as we know, much more destructive. And as we'll see, Jung's secrecy was to play a crucial role in the way the friendship unraveled. With hindsight, it's possible to trace the fault lines that lay behind the eventual collapse of the relationship between Freud and Jung, all the way back to the earliest communications between the two men. However, it was not until perhaps the events of 1909 that overt tensions between the two men started to come into sharper relief. So in March 1909, Jung made his second visit to Freud's home in Vienna. And Jung tells us in Memories, Dreams, Reflections that on this occasion, he asked Freud for his opinions on precognition and parapsychology in general. And Freud rejected the whole idea as, quote, nonsensical. And Jung, angered by Freud's materialistic prejudice, as he puts it, tells us, I had difficulty in checking the sharp retort on the tip of my tongue. But if we look more closely at this encounter, there are a couple of aspects that I think we should note. Now, first of all, Jung keeps to himself. He secretes his emotional response to what's happening from Freud. Secondly, given the fact that Freud emphatically instructed Jung when they first met in 1907 to stand fast against, quotes, the black tide of mud of occultism, it does seem strangely naive of Jung to expect any other reaction from Freud on this occasion. And Jung's disproportionate level of affect strikes one as curious. It indicates a striking gap between his projection onto Freud as potential carrier of the secret, perhaps, and all that he consciously knows about the man. And this gap was getting painfully exposed. And here was really painfully exposed when Jung was met by Freud's actual reaction. And this gap, of course, would be exacerbated by Jung's ambivalence to Freud, which was becoming increasingly difficult for Jung to deny. However, I think there's another factor in play here, and that's to do with Freud's own psychology. Because given what we know about Freud's number two personality, if we can call it that, it seems at least possible that this knee-jerk rationalistic approach that Freud displays on this occasion was actually a defensive move. Freud was trying to protect himself, not so much from Jung's occultism, but against something much more dangerous, his own secret fascination with the occult. And if this is right, then we might see Jung's furious outrage as in fact directed at what he obscurely felt to be a double betrayal by Freud. Because not only was he rejecting Jung's number two, he was obviously rejecting his own number two at the same time. Speculation, of course. Jung tells us on this occasion that his anger at Freud's rejection was experienced in the form of what he calls a red-hot glowing volt in his diaphragm, a powerful somatic resurgence of long repressed aspects of Jung's number two, perhaps. It would seem that this vault in which Jung's number one had attempted to bury all these feelings was beginning to disgorge its contents. Now, perhaps Jung is here unconsciously attempting to discover the limits of his relationship with Freud, testing those limits, and specifically the capacity of the friendship to safely contain the energies of the secret. For Jung, the mystery of the secret had by now become bound up with the conception of the unconscious, which was, and he must have known this, in extreme tension with the positivism and materialism of conventional psychological science, and more critically, with Freud's own psychoanalytic model. And this tension gets acted out in Jung's attempt to on the one hand, communicate the unknowable occult dimension in terms of his relationship with Freud, but on the other hand, sabotaging that very attempt, forcing the issue into a form that on some level he knew Freud would be sure to reject. So consciously or unconsciously, Jung is clearly determined to test this relationship, if necessary, to destruction. Jung was clearly determined, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung disingenuously reports that the 1909 incident, quote, aroused Freud's mistrust of me. But under the circumstances, I think we can assume that any mistrust engendered was entirely mutual. Now, these tensions between the two men seem to have escalated during the trip to America, which was undertaken by Freud, Jung, and Ferenczi later that year. And significantly, it was a secret which functioned as the final straw in Jung's alienation from Freud. So Jung and Freud were, of course, in daily contact. They whiled away the hours, interpreting each other's dreams. And despite Freud's initial failure to offer any useful interpretations of his colleague's dreams, Jung tells us, Jung says he was nonetheless keen to continue these dream sessions. He says they meant a great deal to me. And I found our relationship exceedingly valuable. I regarded Freud as an older, more mature and experienced personality and felt like a son in that respect. However, all this was to change, Jung tells us, when he asked for some personal details from Freud to enable him to come up with a fuller interpretation of one of Freud's dreams. And of course, Freud insisted upon keeping his own secrets, replying with what Jung describes as, quote, a look of the utmost suspicion, but I cannot risk my authority. At that moment, Jung comments, he lost it altogether. That sentence burned itself into my memory, and in it the end of our relationship was already foreshadowed. Freud was placing personal authority above truth. Now, this famous passage in Memories, Dreams, Reflections is immediately followed by another telling episode from the same trip. Now, Jung was recounting to Freud his own dream, the house dream, which, of course, he later saw as foreshadowing the concept of the collective unconscious. So, prompted by the image of these two skulls in a cave at the deepest level of the house, Freud presses Jung to provide some plausible victims of a repressed murderous wish. And at this point, Jung tells us he knew perfectly well that such an approach completely missed the dream and its meaning. But, Jung says, I would not have been able to present to Freud my own ideas on an interpretation of the dream without encountering incomprehension and vehement resistance. So evidently, Jung's ambivalence, which we saw developing during his visit to Freud earlier that year, was hardening into a much more corrosive form of distrust. And his decision at this point to secrete his new ideas about the unconscious from Freud marked what we could call a regressive shift. Jung's preemptive claim that if he had tried to communicate his ideas to Freud, he would have met with incomprehension and vehement resistance, find a striking parallel in those passages much earlier in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he offers all the reasons why he can't communicate the childhood secret to others. For example, he had chosen not to communicate to his mother his feelings about the Book of Oriental Gods because, remember, he said He knew that she would reject my revelation with horror, and I did not want to expose myself to any such injury. And I would suggest that it's at this critical point in his relationship with Freud, when the matter in hand, which is Jung's dream and its implications, Jung's important dream, and Jung knew it was important, this all touched directly upon Jung's number 2 personality. And what gets constellated now was precisely this old, highly defensive, self-protective stance, which was characteristic of Jung's childhood relation to the secret. It seems very likely that this highly defensive response in Jung was heightened by an additional factor, because both Jung and Freud, not to mention numerous commentators in the intervening years, pointed to the importance of a father-son dynamic in the relationship between the two men. It's quite obvious from the letters between them that Freud consciously and deliberately regarded Jung as an idealized son, and Jung reciprocates by responding to Freud as a father. As we have just seen, Jung emphasizes in Memories, Dreams, Reflections that he felt like a son to Freud. However, as we will see, this dimension only worked to heighten Jung's ambivalence towards Freud. Now, hitherto, positioned at the epicenter of the magic circle of personality number 2, if one can put it like that, Freud, it takes on Jung's projection of being a benign and omniscient father. But as 1909 proceeds, this positive projection starts to turn correspondingly negative. And this process is fueled by what were for Jung ominous echoes, I would suggest, of the highly problematic relationship he had experienced with his actual father. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, we read how Jung's storm lantern dream brought home to him the crucial necessity to relate to personality number 2 as an autonomous figure, independent of his ego complex, personality number 1. And significantly, the passages in Memories, Dreams, Reflections that immediately follow this important dream focus upon the painful lack of emotional and intellectual intimacy within Jung's relationship to his father in the period leading up to his death. Evidently, Jung's inability to communicate meaningfully with his father about these matters that were closest to his heart, in other words, the secret, was hugely saddening and frustrating to Jung. And in this case, the secret took the form of what Jung describes as God's world, filled with secret meaning. Precisely the dimension that Jung looked to experience in the deepest mysteries of religion. But he tells us he was profoundly disappointed when his pastor father dismissed such matters in an offhand way. And he says discussions between father and son were fruitless and apparently exasperated both of them. And in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung remembers saying to himself, there we have it. They know nothing about it and don't give it a thought. Then how can I talk about my secret? So for Jung, this is an insurmountable barrier between this inner secret realm of huge value and significance and this outer world within which no meaningful communication could be made. And of course, Jung's 1909 responses to Freud are strongly redolent of this earlier attitude to the father. He says, I saw that he was completely helpless in dealing with certain kinds of dreams and had to take refuge in his doctrine. I realized that it was up to me to find out the real meaning of the dream. Unwilling to explore the possible meaning of his dream in the company of his up till now trusted mentor, quasi-analyst, Jung chooses at this point to come up with a lie. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung tells us that it was plain to him that the cave in his dream represented the, quotes, world of the primitive man within myself, a world which can scarcely be reached or illuminated by consciousness. Jung is pointing here to precisely that aspect of the psyche that, of course, remains secret by virtue of being beyond conscious appropriation. But Jung's dream cave also figures as a kind of crypt. It's a place in which he has long ago secreted what matters to him, and a place which, according to the dream, he is now finally able to explore, but alone, and most certainly not with Freud. And by refusing to communicate to Freud this understanding of the dream that Jung has, Jung is choosing to retain this insight itself as his own secret, hidden in this very crypt that he's just discovered, or perhaps rediscovered. And from now onwards, Jung was most certainly back in touch with the inner secret, but it was a secret emphatically redefined by the fact of Jung's refusal to share it with the man with whom he had enjoyed the closest intimacy of his life. Submitting to Freud's apparent need to find victims of a death wish, Jung makes a deliberate substitution. He says, "My wife and my sister-in-law. After all," he tells us bitterly, "I had to name someone whose death was worth the wishing." Now, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung offers us a series of increasingly unconvincing justifications for this lie. He says, "I did not then trust my own judgment and wanted to hear Freud's opinion. I wanted to learn from him. I did not feel up to quarrelling with him. And I also feared that I might lose his friendship if I insisted on my own point of view. I wanted to know what he would make of my answer and what his reaction would be if I deceived him by saying something that suited his theories." Now, this is really reminiscent of what Freud calls kettle logic. The more reasons Jung offers, the less persuasive they seem. Jung has fed Freud this lie, and then he claims to feel justified when Freud produces precisely the interpretation that Jung has, as it were, set him up to make. So this feels very circular. And this in turn confirms Jung's presupposition that Freud was completely helpless in dealing with certain kinds of dreams and had to take refuge in his doctrine. So these defensive comments are really, I think, redolent of a bad conscience, which incidentally is clearly still active more than 40 years after the event. So both the lie and the subsequent withdrawal from the relationship with Freud, which took place in the next couple of years, all this takes us right back to Jung's primitive childhood dread of the consequences of betraying the secret. And when Freud pressed this idea of the death wish, Jung says he felt violent resistance to any such interpretation of the dream, which, as Jung admits, in particular was important to me. See, it's as if Jung is experiencing Freud's crudely reductive or positivistic interpretation, which Jung himself has set him up to make, as a violent penetration of this secret cave. And it fatally conflicts with the numinosity that was for Jung evoked by the dream. A numinosity which, unbeknown to Freud, echoed the secret experiences of Jung's childhood. And it's hard not to see here this defensive, aggressive grandiosity of Jung's reaction as compensating for some deep-seated inferiority. So, to finish up, for Jung to lie to Freud in these circumstances was, in a way, to symbolically kill him as mentor and father, and thereby, in another circular irony, to fulfill Freud's own death wish interpretation of the dream. This lie led to a permanent foreclosure of any future possibility of relationship and mutuality of connection with Freud. Jung tells us, it would have been impossible for me to afford him any insight into my mental world. The gulf between it and his was too great. But the consequence of the lie was that Jung was back in the solitary world of the secret, the world he knew so well from his childhood. And that, of course, led directly to his experiences in his confrontation with the unconscious, the writing of the Red Book, and of course, the rest is history. Okay, that is the talk. I don't know how long that took. Oh, quite a long time. Sorry. Yeah, that took rather longer than I thought. I hope it wasn't boring, or I hope I retained your interest throughout. Thank you for listening.
Obrigado, Mark. Uma série de perguntas e questões sobre vários temas que você abordou aqui. O seu livro realmente é um livro muito bom, Mark. Bom, a gente vai abrir para perguntas agora. Para quem já frequenta o teatro, a mesma regra. Bota o nome do lado e eu chamo para fazer a pergunta. E, Mark, eu queria começar com dois questionamentos que me vieram, que apareceram para mim ao ler o seu livro. A primeira questão seria: é possível a gente pensar essa dimensão do segredo em Jung atuando como um complexo afetivo? Ou seja, essa experiência do segredo em Jung, que durou 40 anos, 45 anos, nós poderíamos pensá-la se manifestando com todas as características de um complexo afetivo? Essa é uma primeira pergunta. E se a resposta for positiva, a gente poderia pensar que, se o complexo ele molda, né? ele dá uma coloração à vida do sujeito, a gente pode pensar que esse complexo afetivo do Jung, chamado segredo, foi o que caracterizou a relação dele com Freud, com Sabine Spielrein, com Tony Wolff, com Maria Moltzer, com Christina Morgan. Quer dizer, o complexo engoliu essas relações do Jung com essas pessoas que estavam ao seu redor? Essa é uma tese do seu livro, por assim dizer?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think that obviously a very good question. Yes, I think as you imply, the answer to the first question is, I think, definitely yes. It shows up in exactly the way that we would expect a feeling tone complex to show up. It overwhelms him in those moments, of tension, and it's very regressive. It takes him right back to that, right back to the original kind of complex, as it were. It takes, so it in those moments he regresses to those the feelings that he had as a child. So yes. Your second question, yes. So you're focusing there on these other important relationships, which, as you know, I look at later in the book. And in fact, that's a very interesting question, because it's not the way in which I approach those relationships in the book directly, though. My emphasis in those chapters is on the way in which Jung's outer relationships feeds into his developing ideas about the psyche, but that he interiorizes. In a sense, he actually interiorizes those women, and therefore, and what's born is the concept of the anima. So the anima is born from these outer relationships and so on, which he doesn't give anywhere near enough notice of, and he doesn't mention anywhere near enough, as far as I'm concerned. And so, but your question is stimulating, and I'm not sure I know what the answer is exactly, because I think it's a very good question, because it makes me wonder whether certain aspects of those relationships did indeed were indeed dominated by this complex. And yeah, I mean, I think I'd have to go away and think about that, because I'm not sure, but it's an extremely good question. Do you have, I mean, is there any particular example that you have of maybe the way in which the complex showed up in any of these relationships?
Não exatamente, mas ao ler o teu livro, eu fiquei com a impressão de que, por exemplo, na relação dele com as mulheres, há um certo momento como se as mulheres todas ficassem resumidas sob o lugar de figuras de ânima. Então, ao se tornarem figuras de ânima, elas deixam de ser Christina Morgan, Maria Moltzer, Sabine Spielrein, Toni Wolff, como se esse movimento fosse a própria ação do complexo. Ele querendo viver a personalidade número 2 junto a essas mulheres. Faz sentido?
Yes. Yes. Yes, I think that's right. And so in a way, a lot of the way that he actually, you know, this move of interiorization that turns these women actually into the anima is from that point of view, we could see that as a defensive movement to, you know, the interiorization is turning them into a secret in a sense. He's sort of keeping them to himself. He keeps it to himself. It becomes his anima, his private anima, his interior anima, no longer dependent upon these women who might, you know, do anything or say anything, you know. But if he makes it into his anima, then it becomes much more, not exactly controllable, because he still sees the anima as an autonomous figure, but somehow it's safer, I think, because it's interior and not exterior. So I think that's right. Yes. One more thing. What I thought you were going to ask in your second question was whether this complex, in a more broader sense, affects the way in which he develops the ideas of analytical psychology, which is a slightly different question, but I think the answer there again would be that it does, and this is partly related, though not entirely, to what I identify as a kind of one-sidedness in Jung's psychology, which always falls in the direction of personality number 2, and which to a certain extent one can put down to his introversion, but it's much bigger than that. I think that bias and one-sidedness. So as you know, in the book, what I try to do is to a certain extent counter that one-sidedness by emphasizing those aspects of the psyche that Jung has left out, as it were, or put much less emphasis on. And again, that means looking at the outer, especially the outward-looking, relational, connective worldly aspects of the psyche.
Obrigado, Mark. Pessoal, perguntas abertas. Quem quer fazer uma pergunta, quem deseja? Bom. Luciana, quer fazer uma? Tem o Hugo. Bom, então depois eu te chamo. Hugo, Vânia e depois a Lu, tá bem? Hugo, por favor.
Boa tarde, Mark. Primeiramente, eu gostaria de agradecer pela palestra, certo? E eu estava pensando aqui também, né, se esse complexo do Jung acerca do segredo, né, também foi algo que acabou sendo externalizado para a própria teoria e prática da psicologia analítica, certo? Então, a gente percebe que a psicologia analítica tem diferentes vertentes e é como se essas vertentes tivessem sido consideradas como pequenas verdades, né? E parece que a tendência natural, né, dessas pessoas, desses pesquisadores e desses psicólogos em geral, né, é ter um certo isolamento e se proteger em relação a essas questões, né? Então eu gostaria de saber assim, se esse complexo pessoal, né, de uma experiência imediata do próprio Jung foi algo amplificado e possivelmente se é um problema, né, que a gente sofre com isso tanto aqui no Brasil quanto no exterior também, né?
Yes, thank you, Hugo. I think that's spot on. I think that's entirely correct. And I think you can see it right from the very beginnings of analytical psychology in Zurich. There's an inward-looking. There's what I sometimes describe as a bunker mentality. Where there's a mistrust of the outside world, a sense that the outside world doesn't get it, that they might, if you try and explain this stuff to the outside world, they won't understand. So the only way to gain a true understanding is to be, as it were, initiated into the cult. I'm exaggerating, but there is a feel like, especially in the early years in Zurich, there's that feeling, and I think it's still around. Not so much, because now analytical psychology has spread around the world, and that opens it up, and it's also in the modern world. Luckily, it's much more in conversation with other disciplines, with psychoanalysis, with other psychological understandings. And speaking for myself, working in a university, I find myself constantly communicating with people who have no particular interest or understanding in Jung, but who are interested. And so I'm constantly, so the idea of it being a kind of occult secret that must be kept amongst us huddled together here, because they're not going to understand, it has to a certain extent has gone, but I think it remains sometimes in the training groups, the Jungian training groups, especially the more conservative, classically oriented training groups. I think there's still a feeling about that. It reminds me that Marie-Louise von France was famously distrustful of Jungian thinking going out to into the academic world. She thought that was a terrible idea, because she thought, and this is again connects, you're absolutely right, connects with this complex. She thought it would be misunderstood, it would be betrayed, that, you know, it would be lost in some sense. If you speak these truths to these people, they won't understand. I think that's a real problem. Thank you for the question. I think that's a very acute question.
Thank you very much for your answer.
You're welcome.
Obrigado, Hugo. Excelente questão. Vânia, contigo. Vânia? Oi, Vânia, tá ouvindo?
Desculpa, estava sem áudio.
Oi.
Oi, Mark, tudo bem? Obrigada pelas tuas palavras. Eu gostei muito da forma como você apresentou o teu raciocínio, que me pareceu de um formato dramatúrgico. Aqui no Brasil, a gente fala que a gente abandona o teatro, quem passou pelo teatro abandona o teatro, mas o teatro não abandona a gente. Eu queria te perguntar o que essa sua experiência de 20 anos no teatro, como ela influencia a tua prática clínica, como ela marca, como ela singulariza a tua prática clínica.
Well, thank you. Thank you for what you've said. Yes, I think my theatrical background has perhaps helped me when I'm doing public speaking and lecturing and actually teaching. I think it helps there too, to a certain extent. But your question is about how it's played into my actual analytic practice, and I am not sure what the answer to that is. I've thought about it a great deal. I've written papers about comparing, you know, psychology and theatre. I think the theatre model, the theatre metaphor, is a fantastic metaphor for looking at psychological process and specifically for thinking about what goes on in analysis. So I suppose that the way I operate in my therapeutic practice must be subliminally influenced by those ideas. But in terms of a direct influence, I'm not so sure. One thing that does come to mind is that, and this is something I find very present in Jung psychology, the notion that the psyche is multiple, the notion that we, as it were, occupy all kinds of different roles in our life, and that when we're speaking to one person, we take on one role. When we're speaking to someone else, we take on a different role. Jung's idea of the persona, but I think there's a very positive thing about this. It's a mask, but the mask is not only a protection against the world; it's also a way of communicating to the world, and it's a very rich idea. I think the idea of the mask. But when I'm dealing with clients, I sometimes find myself thinking, well, okay, this person is here today, but last week there was a different person here. This person can play different roles, and I'm getting this character here. And what needs to happen is that those different roles need to be brought into communication with each other, and ultimately to be able to speak to each other, to have conversations with each other. And at that point, then I think we can imagine that in a theatrical way, in a way something is going on which is similar to what happens in a play. But this is all a bit vague and not. So to truthfully answer your question, I don't think my theatrical background has played a direct, obvious part in the way I've developed my therapeutic practice. But in the background, I think it's certainly there.
Obrigado, Vânia.
Obrigada.
Ieda, contigo.
Oi, Mark, muito obrigada pela sua palestra. Como a Vânia falou, para mim foi uma leitura dramática também. Tinha o ator e o psicólogo falando. Foi muito, muito agradável ouvi-lo e muito interessante. Bom, a minha pergunta é sobre em que medida a afirmação que o Jung fala, que isso não é arte no livro vermelho, tem relação com esse medo da revelação do segredo que o acompanha durante a vida, esse fantasma. Ou seja, será que ele nega para ele mesmo e para o mundo um outro lado, o medo de ser julgado ao dizer isso?
Yes. Again, I mean, this is wonderful because you are all coming up with ideas which I haven't had in terms of thinking through the notion of the secret. So I think that's again a very good example of the way in which this complex indeed played out. Yeah, but interestingly, I mean, I think what's interesting is it, as always with Jung, that there are two sides to this. So although the complex is there in that Jung does this for himself, it's his book, and he works away on his own with it. Actually, not quite as on his own as we sometimes think, because Toni Wolff was very closely connected with the writing, but in a way, I think Jung thought of Toni Wolff as an inner figure anyway, so she doesn't really count as a separate person for Jung. But it is a kind of solo operation, the encounter with the unconscious and the writing of the book and the painting. These are all, as it were, interior processes, and it gets poured into this marvelous, beautiful work, which, as you say, he keeps pretty secret. Not completely secret, because he does show it to various close colleagues. He shows it to Emma, he shows it to Toni Wolff, he shows it to yeah, I can't remember who else, but there are two or three other people who he shows it to. But again, I think these people who are safe people, they're people who he has, in a sense, interiorized into the inner space. So again, he's not really showing it out to the world. And his decision, his ultimate decision, although we know that he asked some of these people, he asked Carrie Baines, you know, should I publish this? Do you think the world is ready for this kind of thing? And she says she thinks he should, but he decides not to do it. And I think that decision is very powerfully influenced by the secret complex. Yes, I think he can't. It's too secret. It's too close to this stuff, to his inner personality number two secret realm, for him to let the world, the outer world, see it. He can't do that. So this is very interesting, because it means that what he next does, he makes a decision to stop writing the Red Book, and he makes a decision to start writing in a different way. He's going to not write it as he does in the Red Book. He's going to write it in a more scientific, scholarly way, or whatever. But he's going to direct it. It becomes an outer-facing psychology at that point, to a certain extent, which can be read by everybody, and he hides himself behind that. So he never tells anyone, in none of the published works does he mention that he had the experience of the confrontation with the unconscious. He disguises his own dreams as other people's dreams. He disguises his paintings as other people's paintings. And it's only, first of all, in the 1925 seminar with the inner group, that he admits, he tells them about all this stuff, but that's a private meeting. And then, of course, later he writes Memories, Dreams, Reflections, but he insists that Memories, Dreams, Reflections will not be published until he is dead. So at that point, it's a different matter. At that point, then the world can look at this stuff, but until then, it's not allowed to. So I think all this is absolutely, thank you for pointing that out, because that's absolutely relevant to the secret complex. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Obrigado, Ieda. Martinha, contigo.
Oi, boa tarde. Primeiro, agradecer ao Mark, né, pela palestra. E eu queria saber assim um pouquinho diferente, né, puxar um pouquinho para o nosso trabalho clínico, né? Quer dizer, como é que é a questão do segredo, né? O paciente que chega com segredo, né? Como é que é a questão da análise frente a isso, né? É lógico que a gente, né, sempre propõe que a análise é o lugar do espaço onde se deve falar sobre tudo, né? Mas assim, quando um cliente chega dizendo que tem um segredo e que não sabe se vai poder revelar ou não, né? É um paciente para análise?
Yes, thank you. Good, a very good question. Again, I'm slightly thinking on my feet, because these again, I haven't. I seem remarkably unprepared in a way, but you know, these are very stimulating questions. But my initial thought about this is that the analytic container functions in two different ways, and that, I think, is its strength. On the one hand, it operates as a bubble which allows the patient to feel that this is a secret space, this is a private place. Once the patient has learnt to trust the analyst sufficiently, from that point onwards, it starts to become a place in which it's as if the patient is talking to himself, herself. It's as if there's an inner dialogue happening involving the analyst, but the analyst is somehow interiorized into the patient in a way which allows the analysis to work very deeply, potentially. But I think the other face of the analytic container is that it's also an outer relational space in which the patient comes into contact with an other, an outer other, because however safe the patient becomes with the analyst, ultimately the analyst always remains a separate other person, and I think that side of the analytic container and the process is what eventually enables the patient to move out of analysis, leave analysis, go back out into the world. That process can only happen because there's already an outer connection with the analyst. And of course, that relationship with the analyst as outer person is also serves as a model and an experimental space in which new types of relationship can be made, which then eventually the client will attempt outside the container in the real world with his or her real relationships. So I think the answer is that it's both, But the early part of the analysis, I think, certainly works because the sense of safety that comes with it enables the telling of the secret, which, as Jung rightly says in the quotation I quoted, that's a crucial part of analysis, that the patient tells his or her secret, maybe for the first time to himself or herself. So it's a really absolutely crucial part of the process, but it can only happen because it's felt to be a safely interior space, but at the same time, on another level, it's an exterior space, which then allows everything to move out. Does that answer the question?
Sim, respondeu sim, muito obrigada.
Obrigado, Martinha. Mark, vou mudar um pouco de assunto agora. Eu ouvi uma entrevista sua no Speaking Jung, com a Laura Gordon, onde você fala que no início da sua formação você ficou muito encantado com a psicologia arquetípica do Hillman, e que foi uma forte influência no seu trabalho até um certo momento, onde alguma coisa, me parece, da clínica, a psicologia arquetípica não soube responder à clínica. Então, a primeira pergunta é: qual é a sua qual é a importância de James Hillman e da psicologia arquetípica para você? Uma segunda questão: você protagonizou nos últimos anos talvez um dos melhores debates teóricos no mundo da psicologia analítica, com Wolfgang Gigres e o nosso colega Marco Heleno Barreto. É um debate absolutamente genial. Queria te provocar. A psicologia da disciplina da interioridade não é uma psicologia junguiana? Queria saber a tua impressão sobre o Gigres, sobre a importância dele no campo junguiano, qual foi a tua experiência nesse debate? Só não pode contar segredo.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So this is this feels like a debate, and that it feels like a little bit in the past now. So I'm having to summon up my kind of feelings about it and what it was like to be engaged in it. So to answer your first question, yes, the thing that brought me to Jung psychology was, as you suggest, the writings of James Hillman. James Hillman, or to be fair, actually, it was a book by Thomas More. I can't remember what's it called. The Care of the Soul. Care of the Soul by Thomas More. I read this. I was working as an actor. I was in Los Angeles. I was in a pantomime with Zsa Zsa Gabor. And I happened to go into a bookshop, and I found this book, and I thought, that looks interesting, and I started reading it. And you could say it changed my life, because it introduced me to the ideas, first of all, of James Hillman. And then I went and I bought all James Hillman's books, and I read them, and I loved them. And then I thought, well, this is fascinating stuff. I love it. It touches on something very deep in me. It connects all sorts of parts of myself that I didn't realize were connected. The classical world, I studied classics at university. I had a long-standing love of mythology. In a way, even the acting and the theatre, all that felt as if it could all be connected up in a way that I'd never understood before. And I thought, okay, well, this is great, but I probably should read some Jung, because Hillman keeps talking about Jung. So I reluctantly started reading Jung. And I found Jung fascinating. And I then started thinking for the first time, maybe maybe I could become a Jungian analyst. This dream came to me. And so I found a training, and all I wanted was a training which would do as much Hillman as possible. And I wanted an analyst. I tried to find an analyst who was connected with James Hillman, and I found one who was a friend of his. So I was very happy, and so I started training, and I started analyzing, and so on. And years passed, and I remained completely committed to the archetypal pole of the Jungian family, as it were. And I was very mistrustful of Fordham and the London School and all that emphasis on transference and countertransference. I thought, no, I'm not interested in that. I don't want to know about that. So then I trained as an analyst, and I started seeing clients, and for several years that kind of worked. But I realized after a while, I had an experience with a particular client, and this was completely shook me, because it was an analytic encounter that I could not be worked on without understanding the transference and indeed the countertransference. That was the only way to work with this client. I won't go into the details, but you can probably imagine. At that point, I felt I was ignorant, and I felt that I knew nothing. And maybe that's not a bad way to feel, but I had to learn pretty quickly. There was this whole realm that I had to understand and learn very quickly in order to deal with this patient. And of course, having done that, I then, after that, all my clients, this dimension of transference, countertransference became alive for me. And of course, I started seeing all my analysans in a different way. But I would say that I haven't, it's not as if I was, as it were, converted and swung enantiodromically from one pole to the other. I didn't become a signed up Fordham London School SAP style analyst at that point. What I tried to do was to find ways in which to make contact with a truly Jungian way of looking at the transference and the countertransference, which I felt was different from the psychoanalytic way of looking at it. And it had to be different because I profoundly believe that Jung's model of the psyche and his whole approach to the psyche is fundamentally different from the psychoanalytic way of looking at the psyche. So since then, that's really more or less what I've been doing. Now, I found out, I was impressed by Wolfgang Gigerich. I was impressed by the papers that he wrote before he fell out with Hillman, before he wrote Soul's Logical Life. I admired his writing. It was incisive. It was actually much more clear and incisive in many ways and rigorous than Hillman's, I think. And I admired that. And when he wrote Soul's Logical Life, I read it and I read it again and I read it again. And I started to get the feel that there was something very interesting here. And to a certain extent, I became quite influenced by the ideas that Gigerich was, especially his criticism of standard, ordinary Jungian thinking. It seemed to me that there was again a rigor about his thinking, which was very refreshing. And then he had his kind of followers had a first conference about psychology as the discipline of interiority, as they call it. And so at this first conference in Berlin, I went and I'd written a paper about where I was mildly critical of Gigerich's approach to myth, which I felt he didn't do justice to the living sense of myth, and I felt that he had been reductive about myth in a sense. And so this paper, I spent a lot of the paper saying how wonderful Gigerich was, but then I also included some criticism, and I was shocked and surprised by the reaction I got. First of all, his followers and acolytes turned on me as if I was a heretic who had got up in front of them and kind of cursed their leader. But then, even more disappointing, Gigerich himself turned on me, and he ended up writing a 8,000 word article, sort of a kind of destructive article intended to absolutely demolish me and my position. And in that paper, it's worth saying, he used some fairly dubious ad hominem personal remarks, which I felt was again very disappointing in someone who I admired and felt that I had a lot to learn from. So that was a bad experience, really, and I was kind of thrown out of the circle of PDI, or psychology as discipline of interiority. And from that moment, from then onwards, I felt there was something here. And it wasn't just that my amour propre was damaged. It wasn't just that I was narcissistically wounded by this experience, although that's probably true. I also started to develop the sense that there was something profoundly one-sided about Gigerich's approach. And the more I thought about that, the more I could see that that problem also infected some of Hillman's approach as well, and this combined with my increasing interest in transference countertransference and the relational encounter between, and the importance of the relational encounter between the analyst and the patient, and how this was really the place where the magic happened, as it were, mysteriously. And that seemed to be a very long way away from what Gigerich was saying about the fact that the soul, really, the true soul, the opus magnum, as Gigerich calls it, exists on this elevated level of world evolution, and the evolution of the soul occurs on this historical, political, social level or technological level, but it doesn't really happen on the individual level. That's the opus parvum, which is a very inferior kind of space for it. That's how I read Gigerich, and I started to feel that what Gigerich was doing was betraying an important aspect of Jung's work, which actually sought to bring together both the soul out there, yes, out there, the magnum opus is there, but it's connected and in tension with the magnum parvum, the little work, the work of ordinary people in ordinary analysis. That's there is a connection between the two, and there is a tension between the two, which is creative. That's where the energy is when you bring the two together, rather than doing what I understood Gigerich to be doing, which was splitting the two apart. And that felt to me to be not true to Jung. So that was what that was the source of my, and then I thought, well, and then I wrote the piece in the Journal of Analytical Psychology, where I think in retrospect, I rather overstated my case by suggesting that Gigerich's psychology had nothing to do with Jung's psychology. I think that's not true. And there's a whole dimension of Jung psychology, which unfortunately it absolutely is true to. But that's exactly the aspect of Jung psychology that I feel is one-sided. And again, there's a whole other side to Jung psychology, which is much more balanced. And well, balanced is the wrong word really, because it's not about balance, but it's about this tension between the opposites. But that individuation, as Jung describes it, requires this this constant bringing in of the other, of the unknown other into play, and that's the thing that powers it, that powers the transcendent function and moves one on in life. And that's very, you know, that whole logic, as it were, is also what powers cultural change and so on. And so these things are all connected, but not in the way that Gigerich sees it. And for me, that the Hegelian influence in Gigerich's work is problematic. I think Hegel again does the same thing of splitting things. I mean, I may be being unfair to Hegel, I probably am, but that's the way I read Hegel in Gigerich. Does that answer your question?
Com certeza. Eu queria te dar um retorno, que é que essa série de debates, textos trocados entre você e o Gigerich, você e o Marco Heleno, eles são material de excelente qualidade para nós. Então, para vários grupos junguianos brasileiros aqui, nós nos debruçamos sobre esses textos e podemos ter ali uma coisa que não é muito comum na comunidade junguiana, que são autores pensando, dialogando criticamente, mas eu diria que é um momento de ouro do pensamento junguiano. Queria te dar esse feedback, Mark. Obrigado. Luciana, vamos?
Can I just say, thank you very much, and I'm very glad to hear that what you say is the case in Brazil. And I think that actually, thinking about it, that clash between me and Gigerich is perhaps an example of the coming together of opposites and being creative itself. So, you know, that arena offers, in fact, exactly what I'm talking about.
Obrigado, Mark. Lu, vamos?
Mark, muito obrigada pela sua exposição. Você, com certeza, conseguiu sim prender nossa atenção, né? Você se alongou, mas foi excelente o seu alongamento. Eu queria voltar um pouco para a questão que a Marta trouxe da clínica, né? E tem um termo que lá nos grupos que o Marcos faz aqui em São Paulo, não, agora não é mais em São Paulo, é online, a gente traz muito, que é o termo compreensão. Então, pensando na clínica como um lugar de acolhimento do segredo do paciente, né? E pensando como Freud não acolheu a possibilidade do Jung de revelar o seu segredo, eu queria saber a tua opinião sobre qual a postura do analista com relação a isso. Se compreensão é uma das possibilidades do analista se usar, né? Pensando na compreensão, o que a gente traz muito nos grupos é que a compreensão pode ser uma forma do paciente não explicar o que ele precisa falar, não falar sobre o segredo que ele precisa falar, se o analista é parte dessa compreensão. Dá para entender a pergunta?
Yes, I think I understand. I mean, you're suggesting that there's a kind of openness of understanding or an openness to understanding which the analyst models in analysis, which enables, not only necessarily enables the secret to be transmitted, but in a way it connects, the secret is understood without being spoken necessarily through words. Is that what you're saying?
Eu acho que essa já é uma forma de você responder a minha pergunta. Porque o que eu estou perguntando é exatamente como é que a gente pode fazer uso da compreensão, ou seja, mostrar para o paciente que ele está sendo compreendido, sem tirar dele a possibilidade de revelar o segredo.
Yes, yes, I see. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the problems with the idea of the secret, of the patient having a secret which needs to be brought out and so on, is that analysis can be started, you know, one can start seeing analysis as a sort of, it's a bit like the analyst becomes Sherlock Holmes and has to set about sort of pushing around in the unconscious of the patient in order to find the secret, and say, you know, and requiring the secret to be, you know, you're not telling me the secret yet, you know, why are you keeping the secret to yourself, and so on. So I think it's very important to emphasize that that's certainly, you know, not my notion of the secret and the idea of the secret being expressed. And indeed, I think that there probably isn't a secret often. It's not really that there is a secret which finally gets brought out into the open. I think often it's more that the patient becomes able to reveal their authentic self within analysis, and in a way the secret is the way in which they relax and can talk about anything, or you know, it can be, the secret is in the way they take their coat off, or in the way they sit in the chair. That's all the secret too. So it's not, you know, I think it's important to emphasize the secret is not an actual spoken secret, as it were. It's more what the secret, what the patient has hitherto, the aspects of the self that the patient has hitherto felt unable to express, I suppose. So yes, in that case, what matters very much is that the analyst is able to create an environment of comprehension and of understanding, where that is almost taken for granted that is possible. That's I think, I mean, I hope that answers your question.
Sim, foi ótimo, obrigada.
Mark, vou fazer a última pergunta para a gente encerrar o nosso encontro. Você foi um dos editores desse livro. Você acha que o ativismo como uma relação de compromisso com o mundo, com a política, com a cultura, com as ciências, pode funcionar como um antídoto contra uma espécie de inflação da personalidade número 2 que fica pairando no mundo junguiano?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, if we mean by activism being involved in the world in you know, in all sorts of ways, but certainly including whatever, writing, adding your name to a petition, or going on a march, or joining a group, a climate change group, or whatever it is, then, but actually, I think probably the idea of activism should be extended in a way. In a way, it's being, for me, activism is just being out there in the world, being engaged, being in communication and relationship with people, and, you know, allowing those things to happen. So I do think that it's an important antidote to what can happen with the exclusive one-sided emphasis on personality number 2, which, as we've said, is where the emphasis is all on the interior world. And of course, Jung, again, I find one-sided on this, because he can't comprehend the idea that being in a group might be a good thing psychologically. For Jung, a group is always a bad thing. He says that the mentality of a group always, the more people in the group, the lower the mentality of the group. So he thinks of a group as a kind of mob. He talks about the mass man and so on. He can't really imagine anything. He can't imagine that the individual could benefit from engagement in a group, it would seem. Now, I think that shows this bias towards personality number 2 and the interiority again. So yes, I think it's highly therapeutic, especially, I would say, for introverts to engage themselves in the outer world in these ways. And one way in which I see that is because, again, the classical Jungian approach is that the soul and soul activities are interior activities that one goes through sort of on one's own. And then there's the number 1 world of ordinary life, which includes politics and so on, and social stuff. But I think that's a profound misunderstanding, and I think that the soul is just as active and just as present in the outer world as it is in the inner world. And depending on the person, depending on the situation, some people they live in the outer world and they need this work of gaining interiority and gaining access to their own inner soul, as it were. But there are lots of people who, especially the people who are attracted to Jungian psychology, who actually, they need the opposite of that. They need to be out there in the world, and they feel they don't like it and they feel inferior there. And I speak for myself because that's the way I feel too. But its individuation requires that one comes up against what is difficult, and the things that make you feel inferior. These are the things that feed and allow one's individuality to grow and allow one to become truly individuated. So yes, I absolutely think that that's the case. And I have to say that I'm grateful to Andrew Samuels for roping me against my will into doing the first conference for that. There was a politics conference, and he sort of insisted that I did it, and I really didn't want to. But I was so glad that I did do it, because it actually brought me into contact with lots of people, and it brought me into contact with a way of thinking, which is Samuel's way of thinking, in which the political and the social are a place of soul. That is the place of soul, and an important one. And up till then, I hadn't fully appreciated that. So I would like to put a word of thanks for Andrew Samuels there.
Mark, quero te agradecer pela tua presença, a tua disponibilidade. Queria que você soubesse que você é um autor muito lido aqui no Brasil. Seus textos produzem efeitos, encontram repercussão. E para nós, da comunidade junguiana brasileira, ou pelo menos uma parte dela, nos aproximarmos de você, do teu pensamento, de um certo modo muito particular e singular de exercer e teorizar sobre a prática junguiana, nos é um grande presente. Queria agradecer tua generosidade em participar conosco, mas eu queria te fazer uma última pergunta, eu posso? Mark, o que é mais fácil? Interpretar Rei Lear ou ser analista junguiano?
I think they're both impossible.
Ótima pergunta. Muito obrigado, Mark. Muito obrigado. Espero que você tenha gostado. Se você quiser falar algo para a gente, fica à vontade.
Yes, I would. Yeah. I would like to say something. I'd like to say thank you very, very much for giving me this opportunity. It's been very enjoyable. The questions have been of a very high standard and have helped me see things in a different way. And I very much hope that when things in the world get a bit better, it will be possible for me to come to Brazil, because I've never been to Brazil. I would love to come to Brazil, and I would love to meet you all in person. And let's pray that will be possible, even if it means flying in an airplane all the way to Brazil, which shouldn't really do, but I still really want to do that, so I will do it. So I look forward to meeting you all in the flesh, face to face, one day. And thank you.
O convite já está feito. Sinta-se muito bem-vindo. Vamos torcer e fazer para que isso aconteça. Mark, um grande abraço. Obrigado.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Pessoal, obrigado pela participação. Excelente encontro com o Mark. Mais uma dessas oportunidades excepcionais que nós temos aqui de trocar com alguém do valor que o Mark tem. Agradeço a todos, tá bom? E já deixo o convite para a próxima sexta-feira. Nós vamos receber David Henderson, que vai falar sobre Jung e Deleuze, tá bom? Pessoal, muito obrigado. Bom fim de dia. Mark, tudo de bom para ti. Obrigado.